بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Obviously, a lot of people's minds are on the fact that there is a general election planned in the UK in July 2024, and Muslims are again discussing the issue of where they stand in relation to this. So I'm doing a series of little questions and answers on this subject. And the first question that we have to consider is, what is actually voting for? What is voting for? Well, voting is a form of what we call wakala or representation. So if you like, the idea of wakala or appointing a representative is something that's known about in Islam. There are Sharia rules related to this which are known about. Generally speaking, it's permissible to appoint somebody as a representative in a matter on your behalf, but the matter itself needs to be permissible. Okay, so appointing somebody as a school governor, appointing somebody as the head of an organization, appointing somebody as somebody on behalf of a group of you to represent you in a financial investment or something, you can elect or select someone and appoint them a wakil to do that on your behalf. That's the first thing. But the matter itself has to be permissible. So you can't appoint somebody to be in charge to help you go and rob a bank or something like that. Yeah, so that should be clear. The second condition, it should be that the person who you're appointing should be clear that the manner in which they intend to conduct themselves and execute the task they've been asked to do should be according to what is permitted in the Sharia. So if you appoint a group of you, appointed a person or selected a person to be your wakil, your representative, for example, on behalf of you to invest some money, then if that person is openly saying, well, the way I invest money is through riba-based schemes and that will bring you a profit, sorry, as a Muslim, that is not acceptable for me to appoint you as my wakil on my behalf. So this is just general rules relating to the matter of wakala. And we'll go on next to discuss what it is about in this particular election. But I would say as a general rule, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولا تركنوا إلى الذين ظلموا, and don't even incline towards those who do wrong. فتمسكم النار, otherwise you can be touched by the fire. وما لكم من دون الله من أولياء, and you won't find besides Allah any protector. ثم لا تنصرون, and you won't find that you'll be helped by anyone. So as a general rule, as a Muslim, we stay away from those people or those things which are going to keep us, incline us even to do something wrong. So let's resume our question and answer in the next section, talking about what this actual election people are actually voting for. So the question about this particular election is, what are people actually voting for? Well, if we look at what they're voting for, we will see that you're voting for a member of parliament to represent you. Okay, and what does Parliament in Westminster do? Well, the members of Parliament collectively, what they do is, Parliament is the British legislature. It is the way that Britain makes its laws. They debate proposed legislation. They debate what proposed laws come before them. They discuss the pros and cons and they argue that. So that is one thing that people will be promoting or electing a representative on their behalf to do. The other thing is they are lawmakers. That is what they are called, legislators or lawmakers. So actually, when the debate is done, these are the people that actually make the laws and they sign them off and they vote on them to sign them off. So they are lawmakers. Well, we know in Islam, in al-hukmu illa lillah, that the law is only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the parliamentary system doesn't allow you really to do that. So this is in itself is a big problem. And the third matter is that the members of parliament can account, they can question, they can scrutinize the government, its ministers, its prime minister and others about the actions that they do. So this is actually what the members of parliament do. So that is, when people are voting, that is what they are voting for. They are voting for legislators to represent them in the matter of making laws. And obviously in the British system, the laws are not made according to the laws of Islam. And they are accounting the government based on what they believe is right and wrong. And that is the second role that they have, really. So that's important for us to understand moving forward, and linked to the previous question about whether or not voting in the system is permissible. But we're going to go on and explore some other things now about what the various options people, general people, not just Muslims, but general people have before them. Well, what are the options before people? Well, we have really three options that you find people going for. The first one is they actually engage in the system because they believe that somehow the system can work for them to greater or lesser degrees. Some have full confidence in the system, others, they don't have full confidence in the system, but they have enough to continue to participate in it. I will address this matter a bit more in more detail shortly. The last option is that some people abstain from voting, and that can be abstaining from two perspectives. One is an active abstention. The system doesn't work, nothing in the system, nobody in the system represents me, and therefore I am abstaining, I'm not going to vote. Or it can be an abstention of apathy. People, many people in politics are just not engaged in the system, and therefore there's always a significant number of people that just don't turn up to vote just because they don't. Either they're lazy, or they think their vote doesn't count for much, or they don't really follow politics, or they just don't feel the system works for them. And the last group of people are people who maybe engage in the system, but they know the limits of it and they have a problem with it, and therefore they engage in kind of a protest vote where they're not trying to support the main parties in the system, but they want to make a protest of some description. And that's become something particularly notable in this election for the Muslim community. So when we move on, we will find that when people are voting, actually engaging in the system, you need to know one thing. It's a rigged system. In Britain, basically, the last 150 years, there has always been a race between two dominant parties. Originally, it was the Conservative or Tory party and the Whig or Liberal party. And later in the 20th century onwards, it's between the Conservative or Tory party and the Labour Party. Okay, and really at the moment, Britain has a choice of two governments before them. One is a blue, capitalist, secular, pro-Zionist establishment party, and the other one is a red, secular, capitalist, pro-Zionist establishment party. Yep, you vote for one, you vote for the other, you'll get the choice of one of these two. Historically, the blue party in Britain has dominated politics. And after it's been in power for 10, 15 years, and people get tired and they get fed up and they think they're corrupt and they're not working for them and the system's not working for them, well, the red party gets a go for a few years just to be like a valve on a pressure cooker. That's the way the system works. It's a rigged system. And unfortunately, that's the way it is. You need to know that if you want to understand the system. And that's why when many people vote, that's what they're voting for. One of the two establishment parties. That's by and large the way it works. Same in America, maybe slightly different tinges of politics to the red and the blue, but ultimately the system is the same. So let me talk a little bit more about this rigged system. How does it work? Well, I've already said you've got these blue and red parties, which are, broadly speaking, some form of capitalism they support. Broadly speaking, they support secularism, the separation of religion and life's affairs. Broadly speaking, they both support an activist foreign policy around the world, particularly a pro-Zionist establishment policy. It's by no accident that all three of the main parties over the last 100 to 150 years, the Conservative Tory Party, the Labour Party, or the Liberal Party before, all were pro-Zionist and assisted the occupation of Palestine in many ways. And this is not surprising that all these parties share this. Why? Because in every Western secular state, whether it's Britain or the United States or Canada or European states or Australia and New Zealand, they have a certain political creed, and this political creed has some pillars. Separation of religion from politics, that's secularism. To varying degrees, Britain is different to France in this regard, different to the United States in this regard, but they all, broadly speaking, have the same politics. Supremacy of the nation state. Nation state comes above everything, comes above your principles. Those of you that know the history of the UK know that at one time, conscription into the army could have been compulsory. Okay, say for example in the time of World War I or World War II, it was compulsory to join the war effort. And if for some reason your moral conviction was against that, you didn't think it was a just war, you didn't think that it was a war for the reasons the politicians said, and your principles were overriding that, well, you could be locked up, you could be arrested, you would certainly be seen as disloyal. So supremacy of the nation state in terms of loyalty is the ultimate loyalty in any secular state like this. They all have some buy-in in the capitalist economic system, whether that's a riba-based economy or whether that's a fiat-based currency, a currency which is decoupled from gold and silver these days, although it used to be coupled to that, or whether that is the influence of the corporates on the political process. All of the main parties, they buy into that. They all agree to varying degrees of social liberal norms amongst relationships between men and women and identity of men and women. You can see some debate at the extremes of this these days, but frankly speaking, that's just the extremes of the debate. The core liberal social norms are adopted by all of them. They all need to buy into some kind of democratic process, and as I said, some kind of foreign policy that's generally interventionist and pro-colonial and pro-Zionist. That's the way the system works. There is no doubt about that in the secular state, that that's the way the system works. Now, what you can see in the politics of this country and Britain is that there are a certain number of politicians who buy into that, they sign up to that from before they even enter politics. They believe in that. A lot of people in the country believe in that. That's their political creed. They believe in that. There are others who perhaps don't believe in that and then enter the system. So many Muslim politicians, for example, might have thought to themselves they want to enter the system for the benefit of their community, only to find that those aspects of the political creed that they don't disagree with, they either need to change themselves to fit and mold themselves to that political creed in order to advance in politics, or they will be expelled from the system. Actually, that's not just for Muslims. We could see that, for example, with the leadership of the Labour Party at the moment. Keir Starmer was a human rights lawyer that prosecuted war criminals, and yet to have aspiration to become prime minister, he has to accept the slaughter in Gaza and the Zionist occupying forces' right to, quote unquote, defend itself, overlooking things which many of people who from his background would say are obvious war crimes. David Lammy, the shadow foreign secretary, very, very similar. Background in law, human rights law, civil rights law, and yet he has to change that. He has to shelve all of that in order to have a chance to be foreign secretary. Somebody like Sadiq Khan, people who knew him before might say that, you know, as a practicing Muslim, many of the aspects of views on Palestine or views on the liberal norms, liberal lifestyles that people live, he would have not signed up to those in his personal life. Yet to have a chance to be a senior politician or a mayor of London, he has to put those things aside. By contrast, look at Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. He had aspirations to become prime minister. He is just not simply Zionist enough for the British establishment. He does believe in a two-state solution. He does believe that part of Palestine should be given over to the Zionist occupiers, but he also believes in a much fairer, quote unquote, fairer system for the Palestinians. He's also not pro-capitalist enough for the British establishment. So we see the establishment has various mechanisms to protect itself and protect its political creed. And one of the systems is, in fact, the party political system, the establishment parties. So Corbyn found himself expelled by his own party, including Mr. Starmer. And that is one of the ways the system protects itself. So I hope that helps in your understanding of this aspect. Well, we want to now look at what the current political mood is for Muslims in the UK in the run-up to this election. What is that political mood? Well, some are switched off. They're not engaged in the system. They don't really get engaged in politics very much. Some are still locked into the system. I would say amongst a section of politically active Muslims, the strategy over the last 20 to 30 years has been to get into the system and try and make it work for them. And many of those people have not learned the lesson of the last 20 or 30 years. They have not learned the lesson that the system cannot be made to work for them in the way they'd hoped to. Rather, they haven't learned the lesson of seeing the Muslim politicians, even the sincere ones, and other politicians being molded to suit the system rather than being allowed to change the system. They haven't learned the lesson of these limits of the system. It is being said in the current campaign that a vote for one of these establishment parties is basically a vote for genocide. It's a vote for the same old foreign policy. It's a vote for capitalist economics, social liberal values. It's a vote for corporations controlling politics in this country. That's what it's a vote for. And anyone who thinks otherwise is deluding themselves when it comes to the main political parties. Now, many Muslims have become wise to this, and they have gone down the road of a protest vote, looking at voting for independents or minority parties, because they have realized what the establishment parties are about. But let us remind you all, it's the system that's supporting genocide. It's the system that supported occupations across the world. It's the system that supports capitalism and the role of the corporates. It's the system that supports the liberal social norms. It is not just one party or two parties or three parties. So it's perhaps wrong to say a vote for this party or that party is a vote for genocide. It's the whole system that backs it, I'm afraid. That's the way the system works. That's what you're engaging with, even to some extent when you're engaging with some aspects of voting against the main parties. Even if you think it's a protest vote to vote for the minorities, we'll look further at this issue of the protest vote and really to what extent it can work. So this is a big question. Will protest voting help Gaza? To be perfectly frank, I don't think anybody who's engaging in protest votes really thinks that this will help Gaza. I think it's unfair to suggest that they do think that. Rather, what they are doing is protesting against the system and against the establishment parties for supporting the genocide and the slaughter in Gaza. And that's why people are voting a protest vote. They don't want to reward those parties who are backing the occupying power and the murderers. They don't want to reward that, so they're distancing themselves. Let's face it, the matter of Gaza is a state-level military occupation that is slaughtering and ethnically cleansing a civilian population. And the only solution to that is a state-level military response to intervene, to rescue the people, and to replace this awful, awful system with a just system like existed throughout Islamic history under Islamic civilization, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians could actually live side by side with respect and peace and harmony. And so the protest vote, I don't think anyone pretends that that's the system. But also, we should be clear that the system that has ruled under conservative, Labour or liberal, has been the system that created the Zionist entity, created the occupation, nurtured it, promised it in the Balfour Declaration, has armed it, has made excuses for it in the international community, has protected it from being called a pariah and being isolated, has got its proxies in the Muslim world to back it and defend it. So there can be no intervention from these parties which is actually going to really make any difference, or the system at all. So when it comes to, that's the matter when it comes to Gaza. One more thing that could be said about protest voting, and that is that when people are encouraging people to vote for minority parties or for independents, actually the most, in almost all cases, what you will find is it just divides the opposition to one party or other. So Reform UK, for example, is a right-wing party. The more people that vote for it, it will damage the Conservative Party in a particular constituency and enable the Labour Party or Liberal Democrats in those constituencies. And the Liberal Democrats, the Workers' Party, the Green Party, and maybe some of the independents that are opposed to the Labour Party, where they win votes, that will weaken the Labour Party and so strengthen either the Conservative Party or Liberal Democrats who are rivaling them in a particular constituency. So you can see actually that there is a limited value to a protest vote like that. Whilst I respect the intentions that many people might have had in desiring to protest, it's basically when you're protesting, what you want to try and do is get everyone united to do the same thing. And in fact, what's happened is that everybody's been told to vote in a way that they think might be best, which means people are voting. Some people are voting Green, some people are voting Workers, some people are voting Independent, and the votes are tending to be split. So it's got a limited value, even if you believe in it. Perhaps it might have been a better strategy if you wanted to do a protest to say that everyone should spoil their ballot paper and write a pro-Palestine statement on it. That way, in a particular constituency, instead of having a few dozen or a few hundred spoiled ballot papers, you'd have potentially thousands of spoiled ballot papers, which really would send a message to the system. So the question becomes, what are the alternatives? What is the alternative to this entering the system? Well, that's a good question. And I think it needs an honest, grown-up conversation across the Muslim community, which is well overdue. And many people know it's well overdue. The first thing, I think, is an honest appraisal of the last 20 to 30 years and to admit that the idea of entering the system, entering the main parties, trying to get in there and change them doesn't work. Rather, we and others are changed by the system. There needs to be an understanding of that. And also, generally speaking, when you understand the democratic political system as it exists in liberal democracies around the world, you will know they are controlled by vested interest groups, by corporates, by big business, for the sake of the elites, not for the sake of ordinary people. And the more people that realize that, the more people realize that there is such a limited thing that can be achieved through the system, particularly with this false choice between red and blue that represent the same thing. The second question we have to answer is, how can any community have a voice that is strong, independent, can't be tamed, can't be bought off, is dignified, and not under the control of the establishment? Well, that can't happen if you go and engage with government as if you're a supplicant, as if you're asking for something or begging for something, when you look weak. So there has to be a realization that the aim is to have a strong voice which speaks to those in power, rather than a voice which goes and speaks humbly and begs for something from those in power. Another important lesson to learn is, look at our first generation of people who migrated here in large numbers. The early generation of Muslims, they built all the mosques. They did that off their own backs. They did that with their own money. They built the madrasas that go with them. They set up businesses. The whole halal food industry is set up in the UK based on people's own initiatives, and all of this by the permission and help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. None of it relied on favors. None of it relied on things being done through the political system. So that kind of activism is people standing on their own 2 feet. This is one very important aspect of any political strategy that Muslims need to have in the UK. Need to stand on your own 2 feet. The second is you do need a united front on key issues. And no community is ever going to be united on everything. But really where the unity comes in is on key issues. So the issue of Gaza probably is one issue where everybody is unified these days. And there are other issues of principle and which are important to us as a Muslim community. When a unified community that builds its own strength in a self-reliant way, economic strength, intellectual strength, moral strength, speaks with moral authority to those in power, it has impact. Whether they like it or not, they have to hear it. That is speaking truth to power in a good way. And don't forget that government and the state are not the only centers of power in every society. Actually, there is such a thing as civil society. There is such a thing as ordinary people. And if there's one lesson from what we've seen in Gaza, it is that protests on the street, peaceful protests on the street, vocal protests on the street, protests at student campuses, people on social media with their activism, that has really changed opinion amongst ordinary people in the UK in a way that has shaken the people in power and put them on the defensive. And they are finding it very hard to justify to the rest of society why they behave the way they do in respect to Gaza. So much of this depends on how much people think that there is an ability to change things outside of the system, to change opinion outside of the system, I should say. And that is an important thing to understand why we want to have a political voice and what the actual things that are achievable in that or not. Finally, I'd say the issue of Gaza and Palestine, what it has shown the world is the international order, which is backed by the West, has failed. It has no moral authority. It's never been there to serve the people of the world. It's there to serve the elites in power in the world. Whether it's the United Nations or the IMF or the World Bank, the international courts, we have seen this world global system backed by the West has really been shown to be a lie. Just in the same way that in the late 2000s, the global financial crisis showed that the capitalist system, global capitalism, is not there to serve ordinary people. It's to exploit ordinary people to serve big businesses and banks. Just as we learned that the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't really about governments caring for their people in the way they should do. Rather, they prioritized other things. Just as we've seen that backing the change in social norms over society over the years, which has led to the demise of traditional family units, and so cohesion in society has failed. We have seen all these things failing. The almost revolution of January the 6th in the United States, the almost revolution of January the 6th in the United States is something which has shown the divisions in the democratic system, which exist across Europe and within Britain, with more and more parties that are extreme or far right or extreme left in some cases, which are winning power because the mainstream doesn't work for people. That's largely what the vote against Brexit was about for many people in the UK. So why do I raise that? I raise those issues because in the world, there is need for a civilizational alternative. You and I may know that Islam offers that alternative. It is up to us to voice that so that people see that possibility, that there is a better way for people to live, a more just way for people to live. And that is something which needs to inform the political debate, because one thing Palestine has showed us is that the world isn't unified around values that we've been told for the last 75 years that it is. Those values are certainly not universal. They seem to be hypocritical. And what can be called the global south nowadays is realizing that more and more. So that becomes then an opportunity for us to voice those political arguments if we have that united voice, or indeed even if we use our independent voice in smaller numbers to voice those alternatives. I hope those questions and answers have been useful. Anything good that I have said is from Allah. The mistakes are all mine. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والحمد لله رب العالمين.